Boa tarde, senhoras e senhores. Queiram tomar seus lugares.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please take your places so that we can start this 6th edition of Dialogue with the Supreme. Please maintain your cell phone on silence mode.
Pro YouTube? Pro YouTube, né? O seu?
Isso, pro YouTube. Pra TV Justiça.
Ah, pra TV Justiça também. Ah, não, tá.
Já que ele tá achando?
Acho que não, ainda não.
Não, ainda não. Ele tá falando comigo.
Ainda não.
Tô falando contigo.
Ah, espera um pouquinho.
Ele falou pra esperar um pouquinho. Porque antes dela te chamar, ela vai jogar a vinheta. Então você vai dizimar, ela vai me dar 15 segundos. Tu me avisa antes dos 15 segundos, ela vai falar. Entendeu? Tu que me dá um vai.
Tranquilo.
Pra eu falar, agora pode. Tu me avisa e eu te aviso. Tá. Ah, mas aí tu então vai esperando esperar os 15 segundos.
Senhoras e senhores. O senhor vai compor, meu? Se eu puder compor.
Vai ser assim, só um momento. Pode apontar aqui. Se você descer não, você vai compor a
Tá.
Não, seguinte ali. Tem uma colega gaúcha que faz comigo. Ah, não, sou carioca. Já vai dizer minha primeira
vinheta, não é? Vamos só esperar um pouquinho aqui, então. Já vai entrar? Você me dá o ok que eu... Tá, vou esperar lá o ok do YouTube, aí a gente começa, tá bom? Senhoras e senhores, solicitamos que...
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats so that we can start this event, Dialogues with the Supreme. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Please take your seat and maintain your cell phone on silent mode. This event will count with a live transmission on TV Justice and the channels on YouTube. The 6th edition will start now, Dialogue with the Supreme, with the economist Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize of Economy, on the subject challenges of the Minister Vice-President Barroso and Its Excellencies Carmen Lussas and Minister Carlos Veloso, Minister Carlos Benjamin, and Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, professor at Columbia Business School in the United States. We register the presence of Its Excellencies Minister André Ramos Carvalho of the Electoral Tribunal Court, and we greet all the members of the federal courts in the person of
the congressmen that are already here, the Ambassador Daniel Scioli from the Embassy of Argentina, Dr. Raquel Dodge, sub-prosecutor, and also greet the members of our public service office, judges, public servers, ladies and gentlemen. For the opening words, I give the floor for Your Excellency Minister Rosa Weber. Good afternoon to all of you. It's with a great joy that I am about to start another event called Dialogues with the Supreme Court, where we have the honor to hear the speech Challenges for the Economic Growth with Stability and Social Growth, the economist Joseph Stiglitz. I greet all the members of this table. I also greet in a very special way our speaker of these dialogues that we have today. And now I will give the floor immediately for the Ministry Luís Roberto Barroso that will conduct this moment. Thank you, President.
Carmen Lucia and Minister Veloso, that is a friend, and he is not less friend than Minister Weber. And I greet also especially Philippe Senid on the website that took care of the logistic and viabilized this event. Professor Stiglitz is one of the professors that don't need any presentation, principally because his curriculum is so long. I will be very brief and only highlight some of the points crucial in his curriculum of Professor Joseph Stiglitz that gave him the global renown that he deserves. Professor Stiglitz is today a professor in the University of Columbia, a university that is the major distinction that the American Academy can give to a person, and was also a professor in important universities like Princeton, Stanford, Yale, MIT. Professor Stiglitz, as all of us, was the winner of the Nobel Prize of Economy of 2001, and also, even if it is a fact that is less known, he was one of the principal authors of the IPCC that was the winner of the Nobel Prize of 2011. He has some important books on globalization, and that is a bestseller translated in 35 languages. The Professor Stiglitz is recognized in the academy and the economic world for his really important contribution in many subjects with the symmetry of information. That was the theme that gave him the Nobel Prize, and other topics like market failures and economical development and financial crisis. He's also a friend of Brazil, and he's been here a few times and had the chance to marry Professor Enya, that still isn't here, but she will be here soon, which is one of the great specialists in rights and technology. I think that it is a brief presentation, but sufficient, of the estimate Professor Joseph Stiglitz, that we have a pleasure and a great honor to have him here. And now I will give him the word for the time that he deemed acceptable to converse.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be back in Brasilia again. What I'm going to talk about is a broader topic than the one that was assigned to me. I'm going to talk about basically what kind of economy can deliver on a good society. So it's a very philosophical topic in which behind much of the thinking is also the issue of law and the role of law in our society, and the role of rights and regulations. So I'm going to divide my talk into basically four parts. The first two are somewhat philosophical. What do we mean by a good society, and how do we make judgments about whether a society is a good society? The third topic is what kind of economy delivers on a good society. And the fourth topic is what are some of the implications for Brazil today as we think about these issues. To give the bottom line away at the beginning, let me say, I think the kind of capitalism that we've had for the last 30, 40 years that is sometimes summarized as neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism, is leading not to a good society. And I will try to explain why that is. And there's another version, which I call progressive capitalism. There are other names, social democracy, that have a better prospect of leading to a good society. So let me begin with two what I think is self-evident propositions. The first is the economy is supposed to serve society, not the other way around. And sometimes we get the impression that we're supposed to be slaves to the economy, and rather than the economy delivering to us a better standard of living. And the second proposition is that the society that we think of as a good society that we should be creating is a just, free, inclusive, and sustainable one. And all of those elements are important, and all of those are a question today. Democracy is being challenged It has been challenged here in Brazil. It's being challenged in the United States, in India. It's not even being challenged. It's dead in China, in Russia. So more than half the world's population no longer lives in free societies, no matter how weakly you define the term. There's been growing inequality with large groups of populations excluded in an important way. So we don't have an inclusive and just society, economy. And importantly, we don't have a sustainable economy and society. The planet, if you look at the numbers, it's very clear, and we've all experienced it this year, that environmentally we are not sustainable. And it's clear that that's not a good society because it won't be a society if we don't do something about it. The subject of my talk is in many ways related to why many became economists in the first place. They wanted to create this kind of society. But these deeper issues have been put aside as economists delve more deeply into the intricacies of one technical matter or another. This is understandable. It is the nature of any scientific discipline. But sometimes the focus can be so granular that we miss the larger point. John Stuart Mill, great philosopher and economist of the mid-19th century, touched on one key aspect of this broad subject in his book, On Liberty. He argued that issues of freedom and liberty need to be revisited from time to time as the economy and society change, and I believe it is time to do so now. In a sense, both Milton Friedman in his book Capitalism and Freedom and Friedrich Hayek in his book The Road to Serfdom revisited the issues in the midst of the last century, but they were ideologues and arrived at the wrong answers. Economic science has shown that their blind faith in the efficiency of markets had no foundation, and the broader claims, both that unfettered markets delivered the most freedom to most individuals and that it enhanced and indeed was necessary for political freedom, were almost without foundation. Hayek was afraid that the welfare state was setting countries on the road to serfdom. What we've seen is that neoliberalism has set the world on the road to fascism. Friedman talked about Free to Choose, the title of another of his famous books. What we've seen is that unfettered capitalism has meant free to exploit. I believe most of us would share a rough and intuitive conception of what a good society is, one populated by honest individuals living up to their potential, exercising their creativity, interacting with others in honest, warm, and empathetic ways. Individuals would be free to make their choices, have their own beliefs, so long as they don't harm others, and would be mindful of adverse effects on others, curtailing such activities, and they would be mindful of positive effects on others, expanding those. In short, these individuals who we think of as populating a good society are the antithesis of the selfish human being who is at the core of what is called Homo economicus, the center idea of modern economics. The first fundamental theorem of welfare economics praised the ability of selfish behavior to obtain economic efficiency. But no one ever claims such selfishness itself was praiseworthy. Equally important to a good society is that people would hold whatever beliefs they wanted, because what mattered were their actions and whether those actions helped or hurt others. A good society thus reflects what might be called Enlightenment values, especially tolerance, but even more than that. Inequalities in all their dimensions would be limited, opportunities to live up to one's potential unbounded. It would be a creative learning society, attentive to all of the dimensions of well-being that the commission I co-chair with Martin Duran and Amartya Sen and the late John Paul Fitoussi found important, including human security, health, and education. It would reflect not just a concern about inequalities at a moment of time, but across generations, ensuring sustainability in all its dimensions: economic, social, political, and environmental. In particular, it would recognize that we have to live within our planetary boundaries. And with climate change proceeding apace, there is real urgency here. Not only would outcomes be just, but so would the processes through which they are attained. Much of law is about making sure that there are these just processes. And social justice would not stop at the borders. The global regime would reflect the same principles. One of the key ideas that all economists agree is that when there are externalities, markets are not efficient. And it used to be thought that externalities were just a little wrinkle that you talked about at the last part of the semester, the end of the textbook, and you never had time for it, so you never talked about it. But with climate change, it's very clear that externalities are at the core of our existence. The pandemic also brought home the importance of public health externalities, and whether somebody wore a mask or got vaccinated had very big consequences on others. So externalities are really core. In our urban environment, and we're increasingly an urbanized society, we bump into each other all the time. We have congestion, we have, and externalities again are the center of being able to live together. My research with Bruce Greenwald expanded the range of actions in which adverse externalities could arise. In the presence of imperfect information and incomplete markets, externalities matter. There simply was no presumption that unfettered markets were efficient. As we put it, the reason that the invisible hand, the idea that Adam Smith, the invisible hand, would lead, the pursuit of self-interest would lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of everybody in society. The reason that the invisible hand was invisible was that it was not there. And the result was that the market was not efficient. Well, let me go step back, take a step backwards, and spend a moment on a methodological issue. How should we think about what a just society is? Standard welfare economics says that economics has nothing to say in matters where there are trade-offs, where one person is better and another person is worse off. Economic systems are praised if they are efficient, Pareto-efficient, no one can be made better off without making anybody worse off, and criticized if they are not. But of course, that is intuitively wrong. An efficient system that is highly unequal may be worse than an inefficient system that delivers more equality. Indeed, in one of my earlier papers, I argued that with reasonable ways of making these judgments, society would be willing to give up a lot in efficiency, measured, say, as a percentage of GDP, for even a small increase in equality. The question is, how do we think of these trade-offs? Adam Smith, in his theory of moral sentiments, written in 1759, a quarter century before his more famous book, The Wealth of Nations, provided an answer, and that was, how would an impartial spectator assess them? Rawls provided a more formal analysis in his theory of justice, where we are to judge the justice of any distribution of income behind the veil of ignorance, before we know where we wind up rich or poor. I suggest broadening this to consider the entire array of institutional arrangements, thinking about how those arrangements affect well-being. They would include our opportunities, our meaningful freedoms, and as I will emphasize below, the nature of our society. I'm taking a seemingly individualistic Rawlsian perspective to argue against methodological individualism, that behind the veil of ignorance, we as individuals do not evaluate societal outcomes simply in individualistic terms, but include in our evaluations assessments of societal relationships, the exercise of power, or more neutrally, the systems of governance, and broader values such as those I listed at the beginning of this lecture. For the trade-offs that are at the center of the political debates in many countries, including the US, it seems obvious to me the answers that would be provided in a just society are examples. There would be gun controls. The people on the right say, taking away my right to carry a gun is an infringement on my freedom. But I would say that when young children in America have to learn in kindergarten how to duck underneath the chairs, desks, when somebody comes into their school with a gun, that's a loss of the children's freedom. And when they kill people in the mass killings that occur almost every day in the United States, that's a loss of freedom. And the loss of freedom of life is more important than the freedom to carry an AK-47. The same thing is true in the context of the pandemic. The loss of life that results when people, or the going to hospitals when don't wear masks and don't get vaccinated, is more important than the loss of freedom when you tell somebody you have to get vaccinated or you have to wear a mask. So we're always making these balances of freedoms, but when we think about it behind this veil of ignorance, it's clear that almost anybody would agree which of these freedoms is more important. My concern is, in a way, and the reason, this is part of a book I'm in the process of completing, my concern is that the right in the United States has seized the freedom agenda without really thinking more deeply about what freedom means, and that one person's freedom imposes a risk on the freedom of others. Isaiah Berlin, who was one of the great philosophers in the mid-20th century, put it that freedom for the wolves is death for the sheep. So, and I could give you many, many examples, but the point is, we can't think of individual freedoms in isolation. And in a way, we've all recognized this. The very beginning of, you might say, civilization and organized society, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal. That was taking away the freedom of the thief. We said the thief could not steal. That was taking away his freedom. But it enhanced the freedom and prosperity of the rest of society. So we made a trade-off. We made a trade-off. We don't think of it that way, but we took away the freedom of the thief because of the broader gain to society. And that is true of most of the regulations that we have. Sometimes they're so obvious that we don't think about them that way, but they are. That's what regulations are. That the freedom to pollute means that the rest of us some of us we know are going to die from the pollution. And which is more important? How do we value the right to pollute or the right to live? So it seems to me that it's very, this is really the foundation of any civilized society. You make these balances of trade, of freedoms, and in most of these areas, I think if we made the issues clear, there would be broad societal consensus about which of these is more important. Now, there are some cases where actually you can expand the freedom of everybody by imposing some constraints. Now, it seems ironic to say it, but one way of thinking about freedom is freedom to act, what you can do. And that means, of course, if you give people more resources, they can do more. If we have a law that says, let me give you, a stoplight is a regulation. It's a constraint. It says one side can go first and then the other side can go. And it stops you from going. It interferes with your freedom. But stoplights in New York enable New York to work. If we didn't have stoplights, we would have gridlock. No one could move. So the freedom of everybody is increased by a simple regulation called a stoplight. So sometimes regulations can actually expand the freedom of everybody. Well, there's another example of that that's very important. When we make public investments that enrich our society, everybody can be richer. But there is what economists call the free rider problem. Nobody wants to pay the taxes that would support these public goods. So the requirement that you pay your fair share of taxes can actually lead to a more prosperous society in which even the taxpayer is better off. And so that's just another example of how regulations can, a mandate that you have to pay taxes can actually enhance the freedom of most people or all people in society. Well, the final topic, before getting into Brazil, I want to talk about, there are many aspects of this that we could go more deeply into, and maybe in the question and answer period we will. One of the things that I've argued is that, in fact, one of the criticisms of progressive taxation is that people have the right to their own income, and you're taking away that right. But of course, if the revenue that you get enables a more prosperous society, even those who have to pay more taxes are better off. But there's another point I want to make, which is that there is actually very little philosophical justification of much of the income of those who have high incomes. Now, there was an old theory going in the 19th century called just deserts, that people's income corresponds to their contributions to society. And therefore, we should think of their income as the just deserts to their effort, to their savings. And it is true that those who work harder should be rewarded in a just society, and those who save more should be rewarded. But that doesn't mean that the current magnitude of those rewards are in any way correct. There are two basic points I want to raise. The first is that much of the assets that determine people's income, their inherited wealth or their inherited human capital, is not a result of their own efforts. It's a result of, sometimes we say, luck of choosing the right parents. You know, you can say, you know, you did a good job choosing the right parents, but in fact, we all know you don't choose your parents. But the other aspect of it that is equally important is that in today's society and historically, much of the wealth rises in ways that could only be described as exploitation, not from what arises in a well-functioning competitive market. There's a book that's going to be coming out shortly showing how much of America's wealth arose from the opium trade. The opium trade was a trade that was based on addicting those in China to opium. And the same thing for the UK. That wealth was originated from exploitation in the worst way. It's very similar to what happened in the United States, where the Sacklers gave rise to made billions of dollars at causing an opioid crisis in the United States, and such magnitude that average life expectancy has been lowered. This doesn't even mention the extent to which slavery contributed to the wealth of so many Americans and so many people in other countries. It's estimated that more than half the wealth in the South of the United States was in the form of slaves. So that was what was generating the wealth in the South, and it was being appropriated by the white plantation owners. So I could go through, but when you think about the sources of wealth, they are historically very closely linked with one form of exploitation or another. And even when you have more modern wealthy people, that you can't blame them for this. Microsoft, whether you think it was a good innovation or what their role, the fact is that much of the wealth of Gates comes from the exercise of monopoly power. Courts have ruled this against them in Asia, Europe, and America. So the fact is that Gates got his wealth. He's giving it away. That's a great thing. But his wealth is based on exploitation of market power that was illegal. And he knew it was illegal. And he pushed it to the extreme. And we could go on with other cases. So the first thing is to recognize that income that people have, in general, doesn't have that kind of, the endowments, the assets, doesn't have a kind of legitimacy that they would claim. But the returns also are affected because the prices that emerge in a market economy reflect the demands, and those demands reflect the distribution of wealth in the economy. And if the distribution of wealth in the economy is unjustifiable, then the market returns doesn't have any moral legitimacy to it either. So what I want to emphasize is there is very little moral legitimacy to the incomes that people earn. We have to recognize that those who work more ought to get paid more, and those who save more ought to get rewarded. But that doesn't mean that the magnitudes have any relationship to have any moral legitimacy to them. I now want to come to the last part of my theoretical discussion, and that has to do with what kind of a market economy is most likely to deliver on what I've called a good society. And I obviously begin with the obvious point. I've already emphasized neoliberalism that says that markets on their own are going to deliver has no theoretical foundation. Now, sometimes you have something like a giraffe where you can't understand how a giraffe exists because the neck is so long, it defies gravity. And you can say the giraffe cannot exist in theory, but it does in practice. But in the case of neoliberalism, theory and practice turned out to be congruent. That is to say, neoliberalism failed. And it failed just as theory predicted it would. When I say failed, what do I mean? We've had almost 4 decades experiment of neoliberalism. You might date it with Reagan and Thatcher, 1980 or a little before that, more than 45 years. So that's a long time. And it's a long time. It's probably 20% of the history of capitalism, modern capitalism. So it's a big experiment. And the outcome is that growth was slower than in the era before neoliberalism, and inequality is higher. The fruits of the growth went all to the top. Now, I know the data for the United States much better, so I'll refer to that. In the United States, there's been basically stagnation in incomes in the middle. At the bottom, incomes have gone down dramatically. Life expectancy, I mentioned before, is in decline, but disparities between life expectancy at the bottom and the top have been increasing. The life life expectancy, for instance, of the Native Americans is lower than in any country in the Western Hemisphere other than Haiti. Now, it shows, it's like a badly performing developing country. So it hasn't been working. And I think these results are not a surprise. What the idea of neoliberalism was simplistic. I would say it was simple and simplistic. It was that lowering taxes and stripping away regulations would unleash the potential dynamism of the human spirit with more growth, and even if that growth were not equally shared, enough would trickle down to those at the bottom that all would be better off. The neo in neoliberalism was a nod to the idea that the clock would be turned back, even if the world moved on. It wasn't really a new liberalism, it was really an old neoliberalism, but they tried to make it as if it were new. As I've already noted, in an urbanized, congested, interdependent, knowledge-based, financialized economy, externalities and collective goods are more important, so there is a need for more regulations, more public investments, not fewer. Given that, it is not a surprise that neoliberalism was a disaster virtually everywhere. The U.S. has maintained its scientific prowess and the high quality of educational institutions, but we have to remember all of them are public institutions and foundations. The examples of for-profit education is Trump University. And it succeeded in only one thing, figuring out how to fleece its students, how to take advantage of them. It did a good job of that, but fortunately it was held accountable by the courts, and he had to pay multi-millions of dollars back to his students for taking advantage of them. What would it mean for a country built on technology and research if the ideas of the right took hold? I don't know if you've been following, but it's probably somewhat similar here. They are questioning the role of universities and the role of all of the truth-telling truth-assessing institutions. You need institutions that assess truth. Now, we all know that we never are certain. There's always scientific uncertainty. But we can tell the truth in science with a high probability. Courts develop processes. They're not always right, but they attempt to develop processes to make sure that most of the time, those who are innocent are not convicted, and those who are guilty don't go away freed. And one error is much worse than the other type of error. So we've gotten systems of telling. We have media that tries to provide truthful information that provides a check on what governments do. And we've created independent universities with academic freedom to criticize all the other institutions and to evaluate. And it's all made, it's a complex system of checks and balances, but a system of checks and balances within our whole society. And the problem is the right, people like Trump, systematically are trying to destroy all of these Enlightenment institutions. They've questioned the role of the universities, they've questioned the role of the courts, of the media, all the truth-telling institutions in our society. And society can't function. Now, the real irony is that this would occur, the attack on universities would occur in the United States. Why do I say that? Because the main comparative advantage in the United States is technology. Where does technology come from? Research, scientific research done in universities. So to me, it is amazing that they have mounted this attack on the university. They are so suspect, and they would destroy our creative environment if they had the chance. So to me, there is a real danger here that, a successful society, another aspect of a good society is that it's a learning society, and it would undermine that. But the dangers of today's populists in the US and elsewhere are greater. I described at the beginning of this talk some key aspect of what constitutes a good society. I worry that where the right wants to take us is the antithesis of that. As I noted, we are shaped by our parents, our schools, our peers, our environment, including our economic, political, and social systems. We can think of it as a quasi-equilibrium, ever evolving over time, with our shaping our economic, political, and social systems as they shape us. Good schools help liberate us, enable us to see the forces at work within and upon us, to reason and make reasonable choices. Bad education seeks to indoctrinate and inculcate, to rely on blind faith and social coercion. A blind faith in the wonders of the selfish invisible hand, in Gordon Gekko's belief that greed is good, leads to a society where more individuals are truly selfish, a world of unbridled materialism where the very nature of truth is denigrated and science debunked. The irony is that in such a system, capitalism can't even thrive. There is no trust. Donald Trump is the unseemly tip of this ugly iceberg. Underneath are millions like him, only they aren't acting in quite the extreme. The economist Albert Hirschman emphasized that economies can't function without trust, or at least can't function well without it, an idea that has been supported by a host of research since. Capitalism is creating a type of human that will devour capitalism itself. Capitalism without reforms may not be sustainable. And the same characteristics that have made capitalism unsustainable may make democracy unsustainable. The divides in wealth are too great, the empathy too little. The resulting polarization makes all but impossible the compromise necessary for a thriving democracy. One of the worst aspects of neoliberalism is its claim that there is no alternative. The claim of neoliberalism was that the laws of economics dictate the set of economic policies that will deliver for all. Anything else would be disaster. My most recent writings, most notably People, Power, and Profits, I've tried to describe an alternative which perhaps overly focused on an American audience I've referred to as progressive capitalism, entailing a better balance of the state, the market, and civil society with an array of institutional arrangements, including cooperatives and not-for-profit institutions. Progressive capitalism recognizes and cultivates a richer set of values than selfish materialism. It recognizes, too, that in a complex society there must be decentralization, but the decentralized units don't all have to be profit-making enterprises of the ruthless kind envisaged by Milton Friedman. There is need for collective action, and some of the collective action will need to involve the state, but collective action should take on many other forms. The state will need to regulate and tax and spend and write the rules and regulations and help design the institutions that govern our society. And because the state has to play such an important role, public governance matters. Progressive capitalism can only function in a democratic state, and a state can only be truly democratic with systems of checks and balances, but systems of checks and balances won't work if there is excesses of inequality. Thus, a modicum of equality is both the result of progressive capitalism and a necessary condition for its functioning. Progressive capitalism will lead to greater opportunity with more individuals living up to their potential, more individuals having meaningful freedoms, more freedom to choose, more freedom from exploitation. There would be more equality of outcomes before taxes and transfers, a better pre-distribution. It would also engage in more redistribution to ensure more equality of outcomes. We can do thought and real experiments about the consequences of different economic, social, and political arrangements. I am hopeful that those associated with progressive capitalism will lead to more individuals who are more in accord with the values I articulated at the beginning of this talk, the values and behaviors that constitute a good society, values and behaviors that would lead to shared prosperity with societal dynamism, with a functioning democracy, without the extremism, polarization, and populism that marks so many countries today. I now want to turn to the final part of my talk. I don't know exactly how many minutes I've overrun.
You have the time you need.
Oh, okay.
How long would you like?
Maybe 10 minutes more.
That's great.
So I want to talk. I now want to tread into more dangerous territory, if I haven't already, and talk about Brazil.
Okay.
And what these ideas might mean for Brazil. And there are many, many implications, and I won't be able to talk on all of them, but I want to mention four very briefly. The first has to do with taxation. I talked about taxes in my talk. You need that for a functioning society. You need enough revenue to pursue the good public goods, to create greater equality, infrastructure, education, technology. It's necessary for the functioning, I think, of any society. In one aspect, Brazil does pretty good, and that is the total amount of revenue raised. It could be increased a little bit, but it's better than most other emerging countries. But there's another dimension where the current government has made decided improvements. You want an efficient tax system, and you have one of the most complex tax systems with many exemptions and loopholes. That distorts the economy and reduces tax collection. And my understanding of what President Lula is trying to do is to reduce the complexity and reduce these exemptions, which are both create inequities and inefficiencies. But the one area where I'll express a little concern is equity. And the background is very clear. Brazil has one of the most unequal societies. And given, one of the things I talk about all the time is that economic inequality leads to political inequality, and that political inequality means you have tax systems that are unfair. And what you would predict is what you see in Brazil, that you do not have a progressive tax system. In some ways, some calculations may be regressive, that those at the top are not paying their fair share. And the basic, eliminating some of the loopholes would be a move in the right direction, but there is more. You need to tax dividends and capital gains at least at the rate that you tax workers. I would argue at a higher rate, and particularly capital gains associated with land. Land is a natural resource that is part of the endowment of Brazil. And it's not like investing more in land creates more land. Sometimes it does, but mostly it's just pure speculation, and that takes resources away from productive investment. So it actually, by discouraging land speculation, you could actually encourage more growth, both equality and a better economy. Some countries have introduced wealth taxation, given the level of wealth inequality is even greater than income inequality. And Brazil is an example of that. And I won't quote the data, you know it better than I do, but even a very small tax on wealth would generate a large income, a tax revenue. And it's one of the benefits of having a lot of inequality. It's one of the few that if you tax the very top, you get a lot of tax revenue. So, and then taxing corporate profits is also important. And especially because so many of the corporate profits are multinationals, where the income goes abroad. And you have to remember, the corporate profits tax is a tax on profits. For the most part, you deduct the cost of capital in terms of either expensing or depreciation. You deduct interest payments to some extent in different countries. And so you deduct labor, intermediate costs. It is pure profits. And a basic economic principle is a tax on pure profits is non-distortionary, does not discourage investment. And there are some details to make sure that companies don't move abroad. But Brazil is such a large country and a successful country that people will want to do business in Brazil. And the right to do business should mean that you pay your fair share of the taxes based on the economic activity in Brazil. So reform of the corporate profits tax is important. The OECD initiative was a big disappointment. The minimum tax was a move in the right direction, stopping the race to the bottom, but it was a too low of a rate. But what they call Pillar 1 was a complete bust. It didn't work. And we could talk about why, but just to say you should not sign on. And if you sign on, it won't make any difference because the U.S. will not ratify. And so it is not a solution. So that's the first topic I want to talk about. The second is Brazil needs to think more about reforming your financial markets. Brazil's financial markets are very different from those of almost any other country. And what I mean by that is, for the most part, your financial markets finance very little real investment. They are, in textbooks, financial markets take savings from those who have more income than they need, and it gets intermediated and it goes into productive capital investment. For the most part, that is not what happens in Brazil. It doesn't happen in any country quite like they describe in the textbook. A lot of it is financial market speculation. The fraction of real activity is very small. A lot of it goes to consumer lending. So a lot of it, very little of it in any country goes, but Brazil is at the bottom. And the problems in your financial market have been exacerbated by your central bank. Having real interest rates, the highest real interest rates probably in the world, and by a large margin, is obviously makes it unviable as an institutional arrangement for funding productive investment. You can finance people who are willing to gamble, but not people who are willing to make sound, conservative, growth-enhancing investment. And that's going to be really important when people, as part of the green transition. You need people to make green investments, but they won't be able to do it at the real interest rates that are so much higher in Brazil than in any other country. Well, the way Brazil has managed to do as well as it has is because you have state banks like BNDES. There was an attempt to dismantle that, as you know, under the previous administration, BNDES has, if it were not for the state banks and BNDES over the last 30 years, Brazil growth would be a fraction of what it is. So one has to have some kind of reform of the financial sector and hopefully moving to a more unification of a normal financial system. The third topic I want to talk about is the environment. You have to make the ecological transition. Brazil is very important for the global economy because of the Amazon. But I don't know if you fully, there's really interesting scientific data coming out now, or is about to come out, I don't know if it's yet public, that what you've done in the Amazon is hurting the rest of the country in Brazil itself. That the rainfall in the rest of Brazil is very dependent on, so this is not global warming, it's rainfall. And deforestation in one part of the Amazon affects rainfall in other parts of the Amazon. So the ecosystem of Brazil is a very fragile ecosystem, and you, at a very big cost, with very little benefit, have interfered with that fragile ecosystem. And I talked about externalities. This is an externality that you are having not only on the world through carbon emissions, it's an externality you're having on the rest of Brazil. And your policies ought to reflect that. So when you go back to the general principle, I said, you need regulations. When one party does harm on others, this is a real example of that. And the final topic I want to talk about is the role of Brazil in the global society. I began my talk with mentioning that my worry that democracy is under attack. I think Brazil has two roles to play. Brazil needs to show what a well-functioning democracy looks like, how it can address all the problems that I've described and lots more. I haven't had time to talk about information, disinformation, having a good information ecosystem. So there are many, many issues that go into making a well-functioning democracy. The truth-telling institutions I referred to, good educational institutions. Brazil has a role to show as a model of how that can be done well, how you can create, in a sense, a good democratic, good society. One has to recognize that we live in a multipolar world. We've gone from a world with one or two, G1, G2, and the U.S. is losing its leadership of what a good, well-functioning democracy looks like. I mean, I hate to say it, but democracy in America is under attack, and we're not doing very well. And so every democracy has to do what it can to show that democracy can work. And when you look around the world, Brazil and Indonesia today are probably the two largest robust democracies. India is not really a well-functioning democracy. They've been suppressing the press, they've been suppressing academia, but they've not been And of course, nobody would claim China or Russia is a functioning democracy. So when you look at the large countries, there are Brazil and Indonesia. And it's interesting that these are the two G20 countries the last 3 years, that this gives you a chance at the G20 to talk about, what is necessary to create a well-functioning society. So the bottom line I wanted in this to emphasize is the role of Brazil has become all the more important in this multipolar world. And I think this is a particular moment where the voice of Brazil needs to be heard. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professor Joseph Stiglitz. Foi um prazer e uma honra poder ouvir as suas reflexões sobre o mundo em geral e sobre o Brasil em particular. E nós temos aqui agora 4 perguntas. Um tanto curiosamente ou não, elas vieram em inglês, de modo que eu vou ler no original e talvez fazer uma rápida tradução só do sentido. Tanto, professor, as perguntas estão em inglês, de modo que eu vou lê-las tal como estão no original. The questions are in English.
Oh, great.
So,
because the translation wasn't working.
yeah. So, the questions are in English, so I'm going to read them as they are written.
Okay.
And maybe I'll try to translate a little bit. We have quite a few questions, and we have like about half an hour, okay, to end this seminar. So, from João Gabriel de Araújo Oliveira, professor de economia do IBMEC, this is the question. One of the central concerns in our days is inequality. We have countries like Brazil that presents a huge income difference between workers, entrepreneurs, public servers, and so on. However, more recently, we have faced an acceleration in advancements in technology with artificial intelligence that affects negatively the demand for labor and wages, which impact the most vulnerable people. In this vein, how is it possible to provide at least a minimum of income to the ones that will be replaced by such a technology? For example, sellers, call center workers, even lawyers, economists, and so on. So I'm going to summarize it very briefly in Portuguese. A pergunta basicamente indaga como lidar e assegurar renda mínima aos empregados em diversas áreas que serão substituídos pelas novas tecnologias. Please, Professor, if you can answer it.
Yeah, I share that worry that as bad as inequality is today, that the advances in technology, including AI, will make things worse. And particularly because the thing that AI and robotization does best is to replace routine work. And routine work occurs throughout the skill level. There are routine, radiologists reading an X-ray. AI can do a better job, so radiologists will suffer. It's already happened. but disproportionately, routine work is at the bottom. So it will decrease relatively the demand for unskilled labor. So it is going to exacerbate existing inequalities. Now, in principle, a innovation of any kind, including this kind of innovation, makes us richer as a country. So we have more resources as a country. And therefore, or let me say as a world, we have more, we have more, produce more goods. So if we redistributed those goods in the appropriate way, everybody could be better off. But that links back to the question of the relationship between economic and political power. Because unfortunately, historically, we often don't, we don't see that redistribution. Free trade was supposed to increase the income of the countries, and the result of that was everybody could be better off. And everybody, that was the trickle down. It didn't happen because those who were very wealthy did not want the redistribution. They voted against it. They even voted against worker assistance for those who lost their jobs. So this is an example of why I'm very concerned, and I think it is an argument for doing as much as you can before the impact of AI and the other advanced technologies get fully felt. It is really an imperative to go back to Brazil, to have more progressive taxation as quickly as possible. Not to say we're going to take 20 years. In 20 years, things are going to be so much worse that you may not be able to deal with the consequences. So I think the lesson for this is to accelerate the agenda for more progressive taxes, wealth taxes, capital gains taxes, to reappropriate, particularly those who are doing very well. Just to say one more, to put it another way, if we had appropriately taxed the digital giants, Google and Facebook, we would have had enough revenue that we could have protected a lot of those who are being hurt. But we didn't do that. And so they made huge profits, and they were very good at avoiding taxes. As good as they were at making good products, they were even better at tax avoidance. And that's, as I say, and a reason why the agenda that President Lula has put forward of closing some of these loopholes and trying to get to move in a global better tax system and introduce more progressive taxes and wealth taxes is so imperative.
Thank you, Professor. We have two questions from Roberto Aragão. First one is, how do you address the effects of political informational asymmetry on inequality? That's the first one.
Of what?
How do you address the effects of political informational asymmetry? Am I pronouncing this wrong?
Would it?
The asymmetric information.
Oh, of asymmetric, yeah, okay.
So how do you address the effects of asymmetric political information on inequality? That's the first one. And the second one is, do you think the state would address these problems you have pointed out better than the market?
Yeah. So first, in general, asymmetric information gives rise to market power and the potential of exploitation. you know, just to give you one example, if doctors had known how addictive opioids were, they would not have prescribed them. The Sacklers, the Purdue drug company that they owned, knew how addictive they were. But they didn't share that information with doctors, and doctors prescribed it, thinking that they were believing what Purdue told them, that it was not addictive. And that gave them an enormous opportunity for exploitation. The cigarette companies did the same thing. So when you think about all the examples that we see of exploitation, many of them are based on asymmetries of information. There's a general theory that asymmetries of information can also give rise to market power more generally, and that gives rise to, you know, rents and distortions and so forth. Now, can markets do a good job of addressing the issue? Part of the fundamental insight of the economics of information begins with the observation that information is like a public good. That is to say, unlike a conventional private good, if I drink this water, you can't drink it. It's called rivalrous consumption. Only one of us can consume that glass of water. But if I tell you all the knowledge that I've just told you, I still know it. It hasn't detracted from what I know. So that's called non-rivalrous consumption. Let me give you an example of how this plays out. Bank regulation. When you put your money in a bank, you want it to be safe. The bank knows more about what it's been doing than you do, because there's an asymmetry of information. You could hire somebody to look over the books of the banks, but A, they wouldn't tell you, and it would cost you a fortune, and an ordinary business is in the business of doing whatever its business is, not in looking at the books of the banks when they're depositing money. Who should have the responsibility of overseeing banks? The government. Government, when it regulates well, is a benefit for everybody. It's a public good. Now, sometimes the government doesn't do a very good job. I've been very critical of the chairman of the Federal Reserve for doing a very bad job of regulation, and we had a Silicon Valley Bank went bankrupt. Half of America's startups were in that, deposits were in that one bank. It was a massive failure. But the private sector, the private information, had no basis. There was no warning. So the private sector cannot solve these information problems. Or to the extent they do it very inefficiently. It's a really important role for government. Let me say, the media plays an important role as a check to make sure the government is doing its role. When it fails, academics come in and explain where did the Federal Reserve make its mistake, what was wrong, where was the political capture, tries to hold the Federal Reserve accountable. And that's what I meant by a system of checks and balances. But the first source of regulation has to be the government. Now, more generally, your question raises a very big issue, touches on a very big issue of mis and disinformation, which would be a subject of a whole seminar. all I want to emphasize is that the information ecosystem is very, very important. And European regulators are on the way to dealing with this, what they call the Digital Service Act, and some acts about privacy and other aspects of the digital ecosystem. But the important point I want to emphasize is the private sector doesn't control hate speech. It's not doing anything about disinformation. Zuckerberg and Elon Musk make money out of polarizing our economy. So the private sector is not going to solve this problem.
Thank you. Next question. How do you evaluate Brazil's entry into the OECD? Sorry. That was Siri.
What?
That was Siri talking to me.
Oh, okay. Was it giving the answer? What is Siri's answer to the question?
It said, what a terrible accent you have.
Anyway, so my view, I think many emerging markets think the OECD is a more important organization than it is, and that it will have some impact. It makes you feel like you're in the club of the big guys, the grown-ups, the advanced countries, because the OECD is the club of the advanced countries. But being a member of the club doesn't mean they will listen to what you say. Your voice will not be heard very much. So it won't change the OECD very much. And secondly, to get in, you typically have to do some things that are not so good. I don't know if they've changed it, but it used to be you had to dismantle your capital controls. And that means you open up your market to capital coming in and out, more volatility. It used to be said, I don't know if it's still true, that whenever a country goes into the OECD, the following year it has a financial crisis. Korea, that's what happened. So if you keep that pattern, joining the OECD is not a good thing because it will lead to a financial crisis. But the world today has changed a little bit, but I would say it probably has less value and less cost. What I think Brazil should do is help lead a new think tank of the emerging markets that would be focused on your own concerns, interests, and have your own voice heard rather than having your voice submerged underneath, and seemingly supporting the advanced countries whose interests often aren't convergent with yours.
Another question is, you talked about the importance of the forest for the world. How can Brazil take advantage of this asset, and what type of policy would be a priority at this time?
So it's both a global and a national issue. Globally, I think you should be working G20 or chair and every other sphere for a general principle of compensation for environmental services, of global environmental services. So that you get compensated for storing carbon in carbon sequestration. And I think this is both a fair and efficient way of addressing some of the challenges of climate change. So at the global level, setting up these carbon markets and working in that is something that I would work for. And you have an opportunity now that you're the chair of the G20 to put that on the firmer on the agenda. Nationally, it's very clear. There's some research by a colleague of mine at Columbia that's likely to be coming out soon, showing that the development of the Amazon and the way that it was done in the previous administration actually hurt Brazil's GDP. It was a bad national policy. And the reason I mentioned is it has effects on rainfall and the productivity of the Amazon soil is very limited. It's not sustainable, and so when you look at very carefully the cost benefit, Brazil lost by the development of that. So what does that say? You need regulations about the development. The current regulations are just not adequate to deal with the deforestation that has been going on in the Amazon. And it's one of those examples where there's private gain and social loss. That the people who get the land in the short run think that they're making money. But society as a whole is losing. Even Brazilian society. That's the point I want to emphasize. So it seems to me that one has to set up the appropriate regulatory framework and that match that with public investment to make the forest in the Amazon more sustainable.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here. It's an interesting question. Maybe I should give you some background. In Brazil, the university system is largely state-owned, public and free, and so is the basic education. So the question here is, which one should be the priority?
I think both. That's not an economist answer, but we always joke about you have to be able to walk. One of our presidents could not walk and chew gum at the same time. You have to be able to walk and chew gum. The fact is that in a modern economy, you have to have the advanced technology. You have to have the science. You have to have I hate to use the word, the elites to make the society function. But you also have to make sure that everybody has a decent level of education to function in a complex modern society, and that they can live up to their potential. And so, when I talked about progressive taxation, I should have also said you also have to have progressive expenditure policies where you have to raise taxes so that everybody gets the education that allows them to live up to their potential.
All right. Just talking to our Chief Justice, she has another event with indigenous communities in a short while. So we're going to have one more question, Professor, and then. In your view, the ultra-rich create the rules in their favor, and the government is only one of their tools. If you are correct, wouldn't a solution to this problem be to limit the power of the government?
No, because remember that in the absence of the government, they engage in all kinds of exploitive activity. One of the fundamental flaws of the Hayek-Friedman position was the view that markets on their own are naturally competitive. But Adam Smith was very clear. You remember, there's this passage where he says that businessmen seldom get together without trying to collude. And you see mergers based not on synergies that make them more efficient, but on the agglomeration of market power. To the point where in the United States today, we have become an increasingly market increase in market power. And that's with government trying to do something, but not doing it fully effectively. If there were no government, the degree of monopoly power would be 100 times worse. So the idea that an economy could be competitive on its own is just wrong. The same thing goes for exploitation. Think of a world in which the world was populated by Trump universities. Or think of a world where, there are, who would stop the Sacklers from pushing opioids on everybody? And the opioid crisis, the childhood diabetes crisis, cigarettes, all would be worse. The car companies would be polluting the air. We wouldn't. Without the government, there would be no solution. We are headed for an ecological disaster. So markets on their own have created all these problems. Markets won't solve them. Now, anybody who has lived through Donald Trump knows that governments don't always work well. So I don't think a view of government as a panacea. And I explained in my talk that you need collective action of many forms, including civil society, class action suits. You need to have, robust institutions where you can have lots of people checking each other. That's why a free press is so important. That's why you need independent courts. But courts can get captured too, as they have in some countries. So you need, that's why I think of a world of imperfect institutions, not surprised because humans are fallible. But imperfect institutions all exercising a check on each other. And good democratic societies try to structure it so that they limit the agglomeration of power in the hands of any one. And so hopefully, because we still have a democracy in the United States, we still have a civil society, we still have free academic freedom. You have the academics that are exposing the extent of inequality, the outrageousness of some of the policies, the hypocrisy, and I think all that dialogue is helpful. It may not be helpful enough, but and so we don't know whether we'll succeed, but we know what the opposite will result in. It's either this kind of extreme exploitation and inequality, and what I think will happen with that is what I described before. The reaction is going to be populism, and that populism will set us on the road to fascism. So, yes, government is imperfect, but the alternatives are just much, much worse.
Thank you very much. Would you like to make any final comment, Professor?
So that was a good way of summarizing.
Então, Eu, uma vez mais, em nome da presidente, ministra Rosa Weber,
Minister Rosa Weber, I would like to thank you immensely,
do professor Joseph
Stiglitz, and to say once more that it was a privilege and an honor
compartilhar ou ouvir a exposição das suas ideias originais, profundas e importantes no mundo contemporâneo. Nós somos muito gratos pela sua vinda aqui e, portanto, eu devolvo a palavra à nossa presidente para o encerramento dessa sessão, agradecendo a presença de todos.
Brevíssimas palavras, não poderia deixar de reiterar a nossa alegria e extrema honra em termos contado com a presença do professor Joseph Stiglitz a iluminar essa edição dos nossos diálogos com o Supremo. Eu agradeço, professor Stiglitz, por essa belíssima palestra e por essas reflexões tão importantes que seguramente enriqueceram a todos nós. Com especial destaque às considerações que teceu sobre o papel do Brasil na sociedade global. E agradeço em especial, professor Stiglitz, por ter nos lembrado que a liberdade do lobo é a morte das ovelhas. Eu renovo a minha saudação a todos, reitero a alegria do encontro, agradeço a presença de todos, em especial agradeço ao meu querido ministro Luís Roberto Barroso, que nos proporcionou este evento tão expressivo, e declaro encerrada mais essa edição dos Diálogos com o Supremo. Muito obrigada.